I pulled into the gravel driveway of my childhood home, the familiar crunch under my tires mixing with the sound of distant laughter floating from inside. November air bit at my cheeks as I stepped out, carefully balancing the homemade cranberry sauce I'd spent hours perfecting with my grandmother Eleanor's secret recipe. The pearl necklace she'd given me last Christmas felt heavy around my neck, a tradition I'd honored every Thanksgiving since her passing. Walking up the stone pathway lined with my mother's carefully tended mums, I could smell turkey and sage wafting from the kitchen windows. But when I reached the front door, my parents, Margaret and Robert, stood blocking the entrance, their faces cold as winter stone. "You're not invited. Go home," my mother stated, her voice flat and final. Behind them, through the dining room archway, I saw my sister Amanda, Uncle Greg, and shockingly my best friend since college, Jessica, all laughing around the beautifully set table. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. The cranberry sauce dish trembled in my hands as I watched Jessica throw her head back in laughter at something Amanda said. My Uncle Greg raised his wine glass in some kind of toast, while my parents continued blocking my view like security guards protecting a crime scene. The autumn wind picked up scattering orange and red leaves around my feet, but I felt completely numb to everything except the crushing weight of betrayal settling in my chest. Without saying a word, I simply nodded and turned away. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else as I walked back down the pathway I'd skipped up so many times as a child. The gravel seemed louder now, each step echoing my confusion and hurt. I placed the cranberry sauce on the roof of my car and fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking not from the cold, but from the shock of being cast out of my own family's Thanksgiving celebration. Sitting in my Honda Civic, I stared at the house where I'd grown up, where I'd learned to ride a bike in that very driveway, where I'd had my first kiss on the front porch swing. The warm yellow light spilling from the windows looked so inviting, so normal, yet I was locked out like a stranger. For the past month, something had felt off with my family. Phone calls that went to voicemail, text messages with short clipped responses, and the way my sister Amanda would quickly change the subject whenever I asked about holiday plans. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a contact I'd hoped I'd never have to use, Thomas Bergen. I'd met him 3 months ago under circumstances I'd never imagined would become relevant to my own life. My finger hovered over his name for a moment before I pressed call. When he answered on the second ring, I spoke only 3 words that we'd rehearsed weeks earlier. "It's time now." I hung up and started my car, driving to the little coffee shop downtown where we'd agreed I would wait. Sitting in the corner booth by the window, I ordered a chamomile tea and tried to calm my nerves. The barista, a college kid with kind eyes, seemed to sense my distress and brought over an extra packet of honey without being asked. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug and waited, watching families walk by the window heading to their own Thanksgiving celebrations. Exactly 20 minutes later, my phone lit up like a Christmas tree. Text after text, call after call, all from the same people who had just shut me out. First came Amanda's voice, shrill and panicked, through the speaker. "Helene, what did you do? There are federal agents at the house. What did you tell them?" Her words tumbled over each other in a way I'd never heard before, desperate and afraid. Then Uncle Greg's number flashed on the screen. His usually booming, confident voice was reduced to a whisper. "Helene, sweetie, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. We need to talk. Please call me back immediately." The panic in his tone was unmistakable, completely different from the jovial man I'd seen toasting just an hour earlier. My mother's call came next, and for the first time in months, she sounded like she actually wanted to talk to me. "Helene Marie, you answer this phone right now. I don't know what kind of lies you've been spreading, but you need to fix this immediately. There are government people going through our house." The use of my full name told me she was beyond angry. She was terrified. Finally, my father called, his voice uncharacteristically flustered. "Pumpkin. I don't understand what's happening here. These agents are asking all sorts of questions about Grandma Eleanor's things. Maybe we can work something out. Where are you? We need to clear this up as a family." I let each call go to voicemail, sipping my tea, and feeling a strange sense of calm wash over me. The barista glanced over with concern, probably wondering why someone was getting so many frantic calls on Thanksgiving. I offered him a small smile and pulled out the business card Thomas had given me months ago when this all began. FBI Special Agent Thomas Bergen, Financial Crimes Division. 3 months ago, I would never have imagined I'd be working with federal agents to investigate my own family. But as I sat in that coffee shop listening to voicemail after voicemail filled with panic and desperation from the people who just rejected me, I knew I'd made the right choice. My grandmother Eleanor had always taught me that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always necessary. The truth was about to come out and there would be no going back. 3 months earlier, I'd been sitting in this exact same coffee shop but under completely different circumstances. I just finished cleaning out my grandmother Eleanor's house, a task that fell to me as the executor of her estate. It should have been a simple job organizing papers and preparing the house for sale, but what I found in her filing cabinet changed everything I thought I knew about my family. Eleanor had always been meticulous with her records. Every receipt, every bank statement, every insurance document was filed in perfect chronological order. But as I worked through the papers, pieces started missing from the puzzle. Stock certificates that should have been worth thousands were nowhere to be found. Her jewelry collection, which she'd cataloged with photos and appraisals, had significant gaps. Bank statements showed withdrawals she couldn't have made from her nursing home bed. The deeper I dug, the more disturbing the picture became. Someone had been systematically stealing from my grandmother for over a year before her death. Forged signatures on documents transferring ownership of her valuable collectibles, altered beneficiary forms on her life insurance policies, missing pages from her investment portfolios. But the most damning evidence came in the form of a handwritten note I found tucked behind a family photo. In Eleanor's careful script, she'd written, "They think I don't notice, but I see everything. My own children and grandchildren taking what isn't theirs while I'm still breathing. God help me, I should have seen this coming. But I know one person I can trust to make this right." Attached to the note was a small key and an address for a safety deposit box I didn't know existed. Inside that box, I found the real documentation of Eleanor's assets, along with a letter addressed to me specifically. In it, she detailed months of suspicious behavior from Margaret, Robert, Amanda, and Uncle Greg. She'd noticed items disappearing from her house during their visits. She'd caught Amanda going through her jewelry box when she thought Eleanor was asleep. She'd overheard Robert and Uncle Greg discussing the value of her antique furniture in hushed tones. But what broke my heart the most was Eleanor's description of how they'd gradually isolated her from friends and other family members, convincing her that she was becoming forgetful and paranoid when she questioned missing items. They'd gaslit their own mother and grandmother, making her doubt her own memory while they robbed her blind. The letter went on to explain that Eleanor had been pretending to be more confused than she actually was, gathering evidence of their theft. She'd even started hiding small recording devices around her house, documenting conversations where family members discussed their plans to divide up her possessions before she was even gone. The recordings were stored in a second safety deposit box, along with original documents they'd thought they'd successfully altered or destroyed. Reading Eleanor's words, I felt sick to my stomach. The people I'd trusted and loved my entire life had been systematically abusing and stealing from a helpless elderly woman. My own parents, my sister, my uncle all working together in a conspiracy that would have made Eleanor's final years a living nightmare of confusion and betrayal. But Eleanor's letter didn't end there. She'd suspected that after her death, they would try to pin the missing assets on me, the estate executor. She'd overheard discussions about how they would claim I'd been stealing from her, using my access to her accounts and properties to cover their own crimes. They were planning to frame their own daughter and granddaughter to avoid consequences for their theft. That's when I knew I couldn't handle this alone. Eleanor's letter included contact information for a lawyer she'd consulted secretly, who in turn connected me with Thomas Bergen. The FBI had been investigating a pattern of family financial abuse cases, and Eleanor's situation fit perfectly into their ongoing investigation. For 3 months, I'd been working undercover with federal agents, gathering additional evidence and documenting my family's ongoing efforts to cover their tracks. Every family dinner, every casual conversation, every interaction had been secretly recorded as I watched people I loved plan to destroy my life to protect themselves. The hardest part was pretending everything was normal while knowing the truth, smiling at family gatherings while my parents discussed how to handle the Helene situation in private, hugging my sister while she lied to my face about Eleanor's missing jewelry, laughing with Uncle Greg while he sold off antiques that weren't his to sell. But perhaps the most devastating discovery came just 2 weeks ago, when banking records revealed that Jessica, my best friend since college, had been helping them. Working at First National Bank, she'd used her position to forge documents and create false accounts. She'd been feeding information about my investigation back to the family, explaining why they'd started avoiding me in recent weeks. The woman I'd trusted with my deepest secrets, who I'd considered closer than my own sister, had been betraying me to protect criminals. Sitting in that coffee shop now, listening to their panicked voicemails, I felt a strange mix of vindication and sadness. These people had destroyed any love or trust I'd felt for them, but they were still my family, still the people who'd taught me to ride a bike and helped me with homework and celebrated my college graduation. The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. But then I thought about Eleanor alone in that nursing home, watching her own children and grandchildren steal from her while making her question her own sanity. I thought about the fear she must have felt knowing she was helpless to stop them and terrified that they would get away with it after her death. I thought about all the other elderly people who might be suffering similar abuse from their own families. My phone buzzed with another frantic text from Amanda. The agents have a search warrant. They're taking computers and papers and asking about Grandma's stuff. Please, Helene, whatever you think you know, we can fix this together. Don't let outsiders destroy our family. I almost laughed at the irony. Our family had been destroyed long before any federal agents showed up. It had been destroyed the moment they decided an elderly woman's suffering was worth less than their greed. It had been destroyed when they chose to frame an innocent person rather than face consequences for their actions. I finished my tea and looked out at the families still walking by, heading home from their Thanksgiving celebrations. I wondered how many of them were hiding dark secrets behind their holiday smiles. How many elderly grandparents were being slowly robbed by the people they trusted most? How many family members were being set up to take the fall for crimes they didn't commit? As I walked back to my car, my phone continued buzzing with increasingly desperate messages, but I was done listening to their lies and manipulation. The truth was coming out, and no amount of family pressure or emotional blackmail could stop it now. Thomas had warned me that this moment would be difficult, that betraying family members to federal authorities would feel wrong even when it was right. But as I drove through town, passing house after house, where families were gathered in genuine love and celebration, I knew I'd made the only choice I could live with. Eleanor's voice seemed to whisper in the November wind, "Do what's right, sweetie, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." The revelation about Jessica's involvement had been the cruelest cut of all. I discovered her betrayal purely by accident in a way that made the sting even sharper. 2 weeks earlier, Thomas had called with banking records that showed suspicious activity on several accounts connected to Eleanor's estate. As he read off the employee identification numbers for the transactions, one stood out immediately: Jessica's employee number from First National Bank. Jessica and I had been inseparable since our sophomore year at State University. We'd been roommates, study partners, maid of honor at each other's weddings, and support systems through divorces. She was the person I called when I got promoted at work, the shoulder I cried on when my marriage fell apart, the friend who brought soup when I was sick. For 15 years, she'd been the most constant relationship in my life. When I first started noticing problems with Eleanor's estate, Jessica was the first person I'd confided in. Sitting in her kitchen over coffee, I'd shared my concerns about missing documents and unexplained financial transactions. She'd listened sympathetically, offering comfort and advice about dealing with family stress during grief. She'd even suggested I might be overthinking things, that grief could make people see problems that weren't really there. Looking back now, I could see how carefully she'd managed those conversations. She'd never directly discouraged me from investigating, but she'd planted subtle seeds of doubt about my suspicions. She'd reminded me how much my family loved Eleanor, how grief could cloud judgment, how complex estates could seem suspicious when they were actually just disorganized. She'd been so supportive and caring, I'd never questioned her motives. But the banking records told a different story. Jessica had been helping my family create false accounts and forged documents for over 6 months. Her position at the bank gave her access to systems and processes that made their fraud possible. She'd created accounts under slightly altered versions of Eleanor's name, processed fake transactions, and even helped them establish false identities for selling stolen property. When Thomas showed me the evidence, I felt physically sick. Screenshots of transactions Jessica had processed, copies of documents bearing her digital signature security camera footage of her meeting with my father and uncle at the bank after hours. The woman I'd trusted more than anyone in the world had been systematically helping my family steal from my grandmother and planned to frame me for their crimes. But the betrayal went deeper than just the financial fraud. The records showed that Jessica had been reporting back to my family about every conversation we'd had regarding the estate. When I'd told her about finding discrepancies in Eleanor's jewelry inventory, she'd immediately called Amanda. When I'd mentioned concerns about forged signatures, she'd warned my parents to be more careful. When I'd shared my plan to hire a lawyer to help sort through the estate complications, she'd given them advance notice to prepare their stories. For months, Jessica had been playing both sides, comforting me while undermining my investigation, offering friendship while plotting my downfall. Every heartfelt conversation, every moment of vulnerability, every time I'd trusted her with my fears and concerns, she'd been gathering intelligence for people who wanted to destroy me. The surveillance recordings Thomas played for me were even more damaging. Hidden cameras in the bank showed Jessica coaching Amanda on how to forge Eleanor's signature. Audio recordings captured her giving advice on how to alter documents without leaving obvious traces. In one particularly damning conversation, she'd laughed about how clueless I was and how easy it had been to manipulate my trust. Perhaps worst of all, the recordings revealed that Jessica had been the one to suggest framing me for the theft. In a conversation with my parents and Uncle Greg, she'd outlined exactly how they could use my position as a estate executor to make it look like I'd been stealing from Eleanor. She'd provided details about banking procedures and documentation that would make their frame job more convincing. She'd even offered to testify against me if necessary, claiming I'd asked her to help me access Eleanor's accounts illegally. Learning about Jessica's betrayal had been like losing my family all over again. At least with my parents and sister, I could understand greed as a motive, twisted as it was. But Jessica wasn't inheriting anything from Eleanor's estate. She wasn't even particularly close to my family before all this started. Her betrayal seemed motivated by nothing more than the thrill of deception and the satisfaction of wielding power over someone who trusted her completely. In the weeks since discovering her involvement, I'd had to continue pretending our friendship was normal while knowing she was actively working to destroy my life. Every text message, every phone call, every casual conversation had been an exercise in emotional self-control. When she'd suggested we spend Thanksgiving together, if my family plans fell through, I'd almost broken character and confronted her on the spot. But Thomas had convinced me to maintain the facade a little longer, feeding Jessica false information to see how quickly it would reach my family. We'd set up several tests sharing fake concerns about my investigation or false plans for handling the estate. Within hours of each conversation with Jessica, my family would adjust their behavior in ways that proved she was still reporting everything back to them. The night before Thanksgiving, Jessica had called to check on my plans, her voice full of fake concern about the tension she claimed to notice in my family. "You seem really stressed about all this estate stuff," she'd said with practiced sympathy. "Maybe you should consider that your family might be right about some things. Sometimes grief makes us suspicious of the people who love us most." As I sat in the coffee shop now watching my phone blow up with panicked calls from my family, Jessica's number appeared on the screen. I could only imagine the conversation happening in my childhood home with federal agents seizing evidence, while Jessica realized her carefully constructed deception was crumbling around her. I let her call go to voicemail, then listened to her message with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. "Helene, honey, I just heard something crazy from Amanda about federal agents at your parents' house. I'm sure it's all just a misunderstanding, but if you need anything, I'm here for you. Call me back as soon as you get this. We'll figure this out together just like we always do." Even facing exposure and arrest, Jessica was still trying to manipulate me, still playing the role of concerned friend, while probably scrambling to destroy evidence or plan her own escape. The audacity of it was almost impressive if it weren't so completely heartless. But I was done being manipulated by people who claimed to love me. I was done being the naive, trusting fool who believed family and friendship meant something more than opportunities for exploitation. Thomas had taught me that the best revenge against betrayers isn't anger or hatred, but simply letting them face the consequences of their own choices. Jessica had chosen to betray 15 years of friendship for money and excitement. My family had chosen to abuse and steal from an elderly woman who'd loved and trusted them. They'd all chosen to try to frame an innocent person rather than face responsibility for their crimes. Now they would all face the consequences of those choices, and no amount of fake concern or family loyalty could save them from the truth they'd tried so hard to hide. By the time I drove back toward my parents' house, the scene looked like something from a crime drama. 3 black SUVs were parked along the street, along with a white van marked Evidence Collection Unit and 2 police cruisers from the county sheriff's department. Neighbors stood in clusters on their lawns, phones out recording the spectacle of federal agents carrying boxes of documents and computer equipment from the house where I'd grown up. I parked across the street behind a news van that had apparently already arrived, watching through my rearview mirror as the investigation unfolded. Thomas Bergen stood on the front lawn coordinating with other agents while wearing the same serious expression he'd maintained throughout our months of planning. He was exactly what you'd expect an FBI agent to look like, tall and professional in a dark suit, but his eyes held the kind of compassion that had made me trust him from our first meeting. The front door of my childhood home stood wide open, agents moving in and out with evidence bags and document boxes. Through the windows, I could see more agents photographing rooms and seizing electronics. The dining room where I'd been excluded just hours earlier was now full of strangers documenting what they'd find there. The irony wasn't lost on me that the family who'd shut me out was now being invaded by people I'd invited in. My father, Robert, stood on the front porch, his face pale and confused, as he watched his life being dismantled by federal investigators. He kept running his hands through his graying hair, a nervous habit I remembered from my childhood whenever he was deeply troubled. My mother, Margaret, sat in a lawn chair someone had brought outside, her carefully applied makeup streaked with tears as she clutched her purse like a shield. Amanda was the most dramatic of all, collapsed on the grass near the driveway, sobbing hysterically, while an agent stood nearby taking notes. Her designer dress, the one she'd worn to look perfect for Thanksgiving photos, was now grass-stained and wrinkled from her emotional breakdown. Uncle Greg was nowhere to be seen, but I noticed agent movement around his pickup truck parked behind the house. As I watched, Jessica's silver sedan pulled up to the curb, and she stepped out looking panicked and disheveled. She'd clearly rushed over from wherever she'd been when the news broke, her hair messy and her clothes thrown on hastily. She ran toward the house, but an agent intercepted her showing his badge and apparently explaining that this was now a crime scene. I could see her gesturing frantically, pointing toward the house and probably claiming some relationship that would give her access. The agent escorted Jessica back toward the street, and that's when she spotted my car. For a moment, our eyes met across the distance, and I saw her face cycle through confusion, hope, and finally dawning realization. She started walking toward me, but I quickly started my engine and drove away before she could reach me. In my rearview mirror, I saw her standing in the middle of the street, looking lost and abandoned as the full weight of her situation began to sink in. I drove to a nearby park and called Thomas on the secure phone he'd given me months earlier. "How's it going?" I asked, surprised by how calm my own voice sounded. "Better than expected," he replied, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background. "We've already found most of what we were looking for, plus some things we didn't expect. Your family wasn't very good at hiding evidence, and your friend Jessica apparently kept detailed records of every transaction she helped process. It's like they wanted to get caught." "What happens now?" I asked, watching families play at the park playground, their normal Thanksgiving continuing, while my world was being completely rewritten just a few miles away. "We'll spend the rest of today processing what we've collected, then start making arrests tomorrow morning. The evidence is overwhelming, Helene. Your grandmother's recordings, the forged documents, the banking records, Jessica's electronic trail. It's all going to hold up in court. You did the right thing, and you gave us everything we needed to get justice for Eleanor and prevent them from framing you." As we talked, Thomas explained some of what they'd discovered during the search. Hidden in my mother's bedroom, agents had found a lockbox containing Eleanor's original jewelry items my family had reported as lost or stolen months earlier. In Uncle Greg's truck, they'd discovered altered titles for antiques he'd already sold, along with a notebook detailing which pieces he planned to steal next. But the most significant discovery had come from Amanda's laptop computer. Despite thinking she'd deleted everything, digital forensic specialists had recovered extensive email conversations between family members planning the theft and discussing how to frame me for their crimes. The electronic evidence painted a picture of a carefully coordinated conspiracy that had been in planning for over a year. "There's something else," Thomas said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "We found evidence that this isn't their first time doing something like this. There are references in some of the communications to a previous incident involving your uncle's father-in-law about 5 years ago. We're going to be opening a new investigation into that death as well." The news hit me like a physical blow. The idea that my family might have been responsible for another elderly person's suffering, possibly even death, made the scope of their criminality seem even more monstrous. I thought about Uncle Greg's father-in-law, Henry, who died suddenly after what everyone thought was a minor fall. He'd been healthy and independent one day, then confused and declining rapidly before his unexpected death just weeks later. "Helene, are you okay?" Thomas's voice brought me back to the present. "I think so." I said, though, I wasn't entirely sure that was true. It's just hard to believe people I've known my whole life could be capable of this kind of thing. And now to think there might be other victims. "That's exactly why what you did was so important," Thomas replied. "People like this don't stop on their own. They escalate, they find new victims, they get bolder with each success. Your courage in coming forward probably saved other families from going through what you and Eleanor experienced." After hanging up with Thomas, I sat in my car watching children play on swings and slides, their laughter carried on the crisp November air. Their parents watched from benches, probably discussing holiday plans and family gatherings, completely unaware that just a few miles away a family was being torn apart by greed and betrayal. I thought about all the Thanksgivings I'd spent in that house, all the memories that were now forever tainted by knowledge of what my family was truly capable of. The dining room where we'd shared countless meals was the same place where they'd planned to destroy my life. The kitchen where my mother had taught me to cook was where she'd discussed forging documents and stealing from her own mother. But as painful as these realizations were, I felt something else beginning to grow in my chest, a sense of liberation. For months, I'd been carrying the weight of terrible knowledge, pretending everything was normal, while knowing my family was planning my destruction. Now that the truth was finally coming out, I no longer had to live with that burden of secrecy. My phone buzzed with yet another desperate message from Amanda. "Helene, please, they're saying we're all going to jail. There has to be some mistake. You know we would never hurt Grandma Eleanor. We loved her. Please help us fix this." I deleted the message without responding. There was nothing left to fix, and certainly no love to salvage from the wreckage of what I'd once thought was my family. They'd made their choices, and now they would have to live with the consequences. As the sun began to set on what had started as the worst Thanksgiving of my life, I realized it might actually turn out to be the most important day I'd ever experienced. The day I stopped being a victim and started being someone who stood up for justice, no matter how much it cost me personally. Eleanor would have been proud. The next morning, Thomas called me early with news that would change everything I thought I understood about Eleanor's final months. "We need to meet," he said, his voice carrying an excitement I hadn't heard before. "There's something your grandmother left that you need to see, something we found during the search that changes the entire scope of this case." I met him at the FBI field office, a nondescript building downtown that I'd never imagined I'd have reason to enter. The lobby was sterile and professional, with American flags and official photographs of government officials lining the walls. Thomas escorted me through security checkpoints and into a conference room, where evidence from yesterday's search was laid out on tables like pieces of a massive puzzle. But what captured my attention immediately was a manila envelope sitting alone on the center table, with my name written across it in Eleanor's distinctive handwriting. Next to it sat an ornate wooden jewelry box that I recognized from my grandmother's dresser, along with what appeared to be a small electronic device I'd never seen before. "Your mother had hidden these items in the back of her bedroom closet," Thomas explained, pulling out a chair for me. The envelope was sealed and addressed specifically to you, with instructions that it only be opened in the event of legal proceedings related to her estate. The jewelry box contains items your family reported as stolen, but more importantly, it was being used to conceal this recording device. He picked up the small black object no bigger than a deck of cards. "This is a voice-activated digital recorder, the kind private investigators use for surveillance. It was hidden inside the jewelry box where your grandmother kept it during family visits. The storage capacity suggests it had been recording conversations for over a year before her death." With trembling hands, I opened the envelope and unfolded several pages of letter paper, covered in Eleanor's careful script. The letter was dated just 2 weeks before her death, and reading her words felt like hearing her voice again from beyond the grave. "My dearest Helene." The letter began, "If you're reading this, then my worst fears have come true, and my own children have tried to destroy you to cover their crimes against me. I'm writing this letter because I need you to know the truth about what's been happening in our family, and I need you to understand that none of this is your fault." The letter went on to detail months of systematic abuse and theft that went far beyond what I'd already discovered. Eleanor described how the family had gradually increased her medication to keep her confused and compliant, often giving her extra sleeping pills so she wouldn't notice items being removed from her house. She'd pretended to be more affected by the medication than she actually was, using their own tactics against them to gather evidence of their crimes. "They think I'm a foolish old woman who doesn't notice when my things disappear," Eleanor had written. "But I've been documenting everything, every conversation, every lie, every piece of jewelry that vanishes from my collection. I've been pretending to be confused because it's the only way to catch them in the act of destroying our family's legacy." The most heartbreaking part of the letter described how Eleanor had tried to reach out to other family members for help, only to discover that my parents had been telling everyone she was suffering from dementia and couldn't be trusted. They'd isolated her from friends and distant relatives, convincing everyone that her complaints about missing items were symptoms of mental decline rather than legitimate concerns about theft. "I tried calling your cousin Sarah in California," Eleanor wrote, but Margaret had already told her I was becoming paranoid and imagining things. When I called my sister Dorothy in Florida, Robert had convinced her that I needed to be in a nursing home because I was making up stories about people stealing from me. They've systematically destroyed my credibility with everyone who might have helped me. But the most chilling revelation came in the letter's final pages, where Eleanor described overhearing conversations about what would happen after her death. The family hadn't just been planning to steal from her estate. They'd been planning to frame me for the theft from the very beginning. "I heard them discussing how they would use your position as executor to make it look like you had been stealing from me," Eleanor wrote. "Amanda said she could forge documents that would make you look guilty, while Robert suggested they could claim you had manipulated me into changing my will. They were planning to send you to prison, my dear child, to cover their own crimes." Eleanor went on to explain that she'd been secretly working with a lawyer to create a second will, one that would protect me and ensure the real criminals faced consequences for their actions. She'd also been gathering evidence that would prove my innocence if they tried to carry out their frame job. The recording device in my jewelry box has captured hours of conversations where they discuss their plans. The letter continued. "I've also hidden copies of all the real documents in a second safety deposit box, along with photographs of items they've stolen and detailed records of every suspicious transaction. Everything you need to prove the truth is waiting for you." But perhaps the most touching part of the letter was Eleanor's explanation of why she'd chosen me as her executor, despite knowing it would put me in danger. "I chose you because you're the only one in this family who still has integrity," she wrote. "You're the only one who visits me because you love me, not because you want something from me. You're the only one who listens when I talk instead of just waiting for me to die so you can take my things. If anyone can ensure that justice is served and that my real wishes are honored, it's you." The letter ended with specific instructions for accessing the hidden safety deposit box and contacting the lawyer she'd been working with secretly. But the final paragraph was a personal message that brought tears to my eyes. "I know this will be painful for you discovering what your family is truly capable of, but remember that blood doesn't make a family. Love and respect do. You are my true granddaughter in every way that matters, and I trust you to do what's right, even when it's difficult. Don't let their betrayal make you cynical about love, Helene. There are still good people in this world, and you're one of them." Thomas waited patiently while I finished reading, then showed me the contents of the jewelry box. Along with pieces I recognized from Eleanor's collection, there were items I'd never seen before, including an antique brooch that had apparently concealed a second recording device. The technical sophistication of Eleanor's evidence-gathering operation was impressive for someone her age, suggesting she'd been planning this for much longer than any of us realized. "Your grandmother was remarkably thorough," Thomas said with obvious admiration. "The recordings we've recovered so far contain over 40 hours of conversations documenting criminal conspiracy, elder abuse, and fraud. Some of the audio quality is excellent, clear enough that we can identify individual voices and understand every word." He played a brief excerpt for me, and hearing my family's voices discussing their crimes was surreal. In one recording, I could hear Amanda laughing about how easy it was to take Eleanor's jewelry while she pretended to be helping her get dressed. In another, my father discussed selling Eleanor's antique furniture and expressed satisfaction that she was too out of it to notice. But the most damaging recording was a conversation between my mother and Uncle Greg about their plans for after Eleanor's death. Their voices were clear and unmistakable as they discussed forging documents to implicate me and dividing the stolen assets among themselves. The beauty of it is that Helene will be so focused on grief and estate responsibilities that she won't notice the discrepancies until it's too late," Margaret's voice said on the recording. "By then, we'll have all the evidence planted to make her look guilty, and we'll be the innocent family members who discovered her theft." Listening to my own mother calmly planning my destruction was perhaps the most painful moment in this entire ordeal. The woman who'd raised me, who taught me right from wrong, who I'd trusted and loved unconditionally, had been plotting to send me to prison to cover her own crimes. Thomas turned off the recording and looked at me with sympathy. "I know this is difficult, but these recordings are going to be crucial evidence in the prosecution. Your grandmother essentially built the entire case for us, documenting criminal behavior that would have been almost impossible to prove otherwise." As I sat in that sterile conference room surrounded by evidence of my family's betrayal, I felt Eleanor's presence more strongly than I had since her death. She'd known she was dying, but she'd spent her final months not just protecting herself, but protecting me from people who claimed to love us both. Even facing her own mortality, she'd been thinking about justice and making sure the truth would eventually come to light. The realization that Eleanor had endured months of abuse while secretly fighting back filled me with a mixture of grief and admiration. She'd been far braver and more resourceful than anyone had given her credit for turning her apparent helplessness into a weapon against her abusers. But more than anything, I felt grateful that she'd trusted me enough to make me part of her plan for justice. Even from beyond the grave, Eleanor was still teaching me about courage, integrity, and the importance of standing up for what's right regardless of the personal cost. The evidence she'd gathered would ensure that her abusers faced consequences for their crimes, and that I would be protected from their attempts to frame me. But perhaps most importantly, her final message reminded me that love and family aren't about blood relationships, but about the people who stand by you when everything falls apart. Eleanor had been more than my grandmother. She'd been my protector, my ally, and my inspiration for doing the right thing, even when it meant standing alone against the people who were supposed to love me most. Thomas led me to a smaller room equipped with professional audio equipment where a technician named Marcus was organizing and cataloging the recordings Eleanor had secretly made. Dozens of small digital files were displayed on computer screens, each one labeled with dates and brief descriptions of the content. The sheer volume of evidence was overwhelming, representing months of careful documentation by a woman everyone thought was too confused to notice what was happening around her. "We've been working through these recordings all night," Thomas explained, settling into a chair beside me. "Your grandmother was incredibly systematic about this. She didn't just record randomly. She targeted specific conversations and family gatherings where she suspected criminal activity would be discussed." Marcus pulled up the first recording dated 8 months before Eleanor's death. The audio quality was surprisingly clear, capturing a conversation that had taken place in Eleanor's living room during what was supposed to be a casual family visit. "This one features your parents and Uncle Greg discussing the initial phases of their plan," Marcus said, adjusting the volume. "Listen carefully to how they talk about Eleanor. It's clear they view her as an obstacle rather than a family member." The recording began with the sound of chairs scraping across hardwood floors and casual conversation about weekend plans. But within minutes, the tone changed dramatically as my family members moved from pleasantries to planning criminal activity. "The old woman is getting suspicious about the missing stock certificates," Uncle Greg's voice said with obvious irritation. "She asked me yesterday where the IBM shares went, claimed she couldn't find them in her files." "We need to be more careful about what we take and when," my father replied. "Maybe space things out more so she doesn't notice patterns. Or we could increase her evening medication," my mother suggested in a tone so casual she might have been discussing the weather. "Dr. Williams said the sleeping pills can cause memory issues. If she's more confused, she won't notice missing items as quickly." The callousness in their voices was shocking. They were discussing drugging an elderly woman to facilitate their theft, treating Eleanor's well-being as nothing more than an inconvenience to their criminal enterprise. But the conversation got even worse as they began discussing long-term plans. "The jewelry is the real prize," Amanda's voice joined the conversation. "I've been cataloging pieces during my visits, taking photos when she's in the bathroom. Some of those items are worth serious money, especially the vintage pieces from great-grandfather's collection." "We need to be strategic about timing," Robert continued. "Take the most valuable pieces first, but leave enough behind that the theft isn't obvious until after she's gone. Then we can claim everything disappeared during the estate settlement process." But the most chilling part of the conversation came when they began discussing my role in their plans. "Helene is going to be a problem," Margaret said. "She's too honest, too careful with details. If she notices discrepancies in the estate, she might start asking questions." "That's actually perfect," Uncle Greg replied, with what sounded like satisfaction. "We can use her honesty against her, make it look like she's been stealing from Eleanor, then play the role of shocked family members who discovered her betrayal. Her position as executor gives us the perfect cover story." The recording continued for another 20 minutes with my family members discussing specific items they planned to steal, methods for forging documents, and detailed strategies for framing me for their crimes. They talked about me like I was a chess piece in their game, rather than a family member they claimed to love. Marcus switched to a different recording, this one from just 3 months before Eleanor's death. The conversation took place during a family dinner with multiple voices overlapping as they discussed their escalating theft and growing concerns about discovery. "I sold 3 of the antique chairs this week," Uncle Greg reported. "Got $1,200 for the set. The buyer didn't ask any questions about provenance." "Good," my father replied. "But we need to replace them with similar pieces so Helene doesn't notice they're gone when she eventually visits. Maybe something from a thrift store that looks period appropriate." "What about the life insurance policies?" Amanda asked. "Have we figured out how to handle the beneficiary changes?" "Jessica is working on that," my mother answered, and hearing my best friend's name in this context made my stomach lurch. "She says she can process the paperwork at the bank without leaving obvious traces. Eleanor's signature is easy to forge since her handwriting has gotten shaky." The casual mention of Jessica's involvement confirmed that her betrayal had been planned from the beginning, not something she'd stumbled into later. She'd been an integral part of their conspiracy, using her banking position to facilitate fraud while pretending to be my supportive friend. But perhaps the most damning recording was one that captured a conversation between my parents and Amanda, discussing what they called the Helene problem in detail. "She's been asking too many questions about the estate paperwork," Amanda complained. "Yesterday, she wanted to know why some of the insurance documents looked different from the copies she'd seen before." "We knew this would happen eventually," Margaret replied. "That's why we need to accelerate the timeline. Get the rest of the valuable items out, finish altering the documents, then spring the trap before she figures out what's really going on." "The beauty of it is her own honesty will destroy her," Robert added with obvious satisfaction. "When federal investigators find forged documents with her signature on them, her reputation for integrity will actually work against her. Nobody will believe someone so seemingly trustworthy could be innocent of such elaborate fraud." Listening to my father discuss destroying my life with such cold calculation was perhaps the most painful moment in this entire ordeal. The man who taught me to ride a bike, helped me with math homework, and walked me down the aisle at my wedding was planning to send me to federal prison to cover his own crimes. The recordings went on to reveal that they'd been planning this frame job for over a year, carefully documenting my access to Eleanor's accounts and properties while creating false evidence of theft. They'd even discussed hiring a private investigator to discover evidence of my supposed crimes at just the right moment to maximize the impact on law enforcement. Thomas paused the playback and looked at me with concern. "Are you okay? I know this is difficult to hear." "It's horrific," I replied honestly, "but I need to hear all of it." Eleanor suffered through these conversations in real time, knowing exactly what they were planning. The least I can do is listen to the evidence she gathered at such great personal cost. Marcus pulled up one final recording that Eleanor had made just days before her death. Her voice was weak, but determined as she spoke directly into the recording device, apparently during a moment when she was alone in her room. "If someone is listening to this, it means my family succeeded in killing me," Eleanor's voice said, and the words hit me like a physical blow. "They've been giving me extra medication for months now, making me sleep more and confusing my thoughts, but I know what they're doing, and I know why." The recording continued, with Eleanor describing how family members had been systematically increasing her dosage of sleeping medication and anxiety pills, often dissolving extra pills in her evening tea or soup. The medication made her drowsy and confused, creating the perfect conditions for theft, while also making her appear incompetent to outside observers. "And they think they're so clever," Eleanor continued, "but I've been pretending to be more affected than I actually am. I spit out pills when they're not watching, pour out drinks that taste wrong, and stay alert during conversations. They think I'm too confused to understand." But the most devastating part of Eleanor's final recording was her description of the emotional abuse she'd endured alongside the theft and drugging. "They mock me when they think I can't hear," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "They laugh about how easy it is to fool the old woman and make jokes about waiting for me to die so they can finally get their hands on my money. They've turned my final years into a living nightmare of betrayal and humiliation." The recording ended with Eleanor's promise that justice would eventually be served, even if she didn't live to see it. "I've gathered enough evidence to protect Helene and destroy the people who think they can abuse helpless elderly women without consequences," she concluded. "I may be dying, but I won't let them win." As the audio ended, the room fell silent except for the quiet hum of electronic equipment. I sat there processing the full scope of my family's crimes, which went far beyond simple theft to include elder abuse, drugging, fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder through medication overdose. Thomas broke the silence gently. "Helene, based on these recordings and the other evidence we've gathered, we have enough to file federal charges against everyone involved. This case is going to result in significant prison sentences for your family members and Jessica." I nodded, feeling a complex mixture of grief, anger, and determination. Eleanor had endured months of abuse and died knowing her own family was slowly killing her, but she'd also ensured that her suffering wouldn't be in vain. Her evidence would not only clear my name, but also prevent these people from hurting anyone else. "What's the next step?" I asked. "Tomorrow morning we start making arrests," Thomas replied. "And thanks to your grandmother's courage and preparation, we have everything we need to ensure that justice is finally served." I woke up early the next morning to the sound of my phone buzzing with a text from Thomas. "It's happening now. Stay safe and don't answer calls from family members until we're done." I made coffee and tried to focus on normal activities, but my mind kept drifting to what was unfolding across town at the houses and workplaces of people I'd once considered my closest family and friends. The first arrest happened at 6 in the morning at my parents' house. Thomas called me with updates as the operation progressed, describing how federal agents had surrounded the property before sunrise to prevent any attempts to flee or destroy evidence. My father, Robert, had answered the door in his bathrobe, apparently believing the early morning visitors were delivering packages until Agent Sarah Martinez identified herself and began reading him his rights. "Your father's reaction was interesting," Thomas told me during our first check-in call. He immediately asked if this was about Eleanor's estate, which essentially confirmed his knowledge of criminal activity before we even started questioning him. Most innocent people would ask why federal agents were at their door, not immediately reference a specific potential crime. My mother, Margaret, had been taken into custody while trying to flush documents down the toilet in their master bathroom. Agents had secured the house before making contact, so they witnessed her desperate attempt to destroy evidence through surveillance equipment. The documents she'd been trying to destroy turned out to be forged insurance papers and altered banking forms, exactly the kind of evidence that would have been crucial for their planned frame job against me. Uncle Greg's arrest had been more dramatic. Federal agents had surrounded his house just as he was loading suitcases into his pickup truck, apparently planning to flee town before the investigation could reach him. When agents approached, he'd tried to run through his backyard but had been tackled by Agent Johnson near the property fence. The suitcases contained over $30,000 in cash, Eleanor's jewelry, and a notebook detailing plans to establish a new identity in another state. But perhaps the most satisfying arrest was Amanda's. Federal agents had waited for her at her workplace, a high-end marketing firm downtown, timing the arrest for maximum visibility among her colleagues and clients. According to Thomas, she'd been in the middle of a presentation to important clients when agents entered the conference room and formally placed her under arrest for elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. She tried to claim it was all a misunderstanding, Thomas reported with obvious amusement, kept insisting she was innocent while her clients and co-workers watched federal agents escort her out in handcuffs. Her professional reputation is definitely finished, regardless of how the legal proceedings turn out. The final arrest was Jessica's, and in many ways it was the most satisfying of all. Federal agents had coordinated with bank security to arrest her at First National during the morning rush when the lobby was full of customers and employees. She'd been helping an elderly client with his accounts when agents approached her teller window and announced she was under arrest for banking fraud and conspiracy. Thomas described how Jessica had initially tried to maintain her innocent facade, expressing confusion and asking what was happening, as if she had no idea why federal agents might want to speak with her. But when Agent Martinez began reading specific charges related to forged documents and fraudulent accounts, Jessica's composure had cracked completely. She broke down crying in the middle of the bank lobby, Thomas told me. Started babbling about how it wasn't her idea and how your family had pressured her into helping them. Classic criminal behavior, trying to blame everyone else the moment they're caught. By noon, all 5 conspirators were in federal custody, each being held without bail due to flight risk concerns evidenced by Uncle Greg's attempted escape. Local news crews had gathered outside the FBI building downtown, having been tipped off about what reporters were already calling a shocking case of family betrayal and elder abuse. I spent the day at home watching news coverage that painted the story in broad strokes without revealing specific details that might compromise the prosecution. The local anchor described it as an investigation into alleged financial crimes targeting an elderly victim, and mentioned that multiple family members and associates had been arrested in connection with the case. But the most significant development came that afternoon when Thomas called with unexpected news about Amanda's behavior in custody. "Your sister is asking to make a deal," he said, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background. "She wants to cooperate fully in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her lawyer thinks she can provide information about additional crimes we haven't discovered yet." The prospect of Amanda turning against the rest of the family felt like poetic justice, given how eagerly they'd all planned to sacrifice me for their crimes. But I was also curious about what additional information she might have, especially given Eleanor's recordings suggesting this wasn't their first time targeting an elderly family member. What kind of additional information, I asked. She's claiming there were other victims, other elderly relatives who suffered similar abuse in previous years. She's also suggesting that some of the medications they were giving Eleanor might have directly contributed to her death, which could elevate some of the charges to negligent homicide or even murder. The possibility that my family had actually murdered Eleanor through medication overdose was a horrifying escalation of crimes I thought couldn't get any worse. But it also meant that Eleanor's death might finally be properly investigated, rather than dismissed as the natural passing of an elderly woman with health problems. That evening, I received a call from Detective Susan Walsh of the county coroner's office. She explained that based on information provided by Amanda during her interrogation, they were reopening the investigation into Eleanor's death and requesting permission to exhume her body for toxicology testing. "We have reason to believe your grandmother may have died from medication overdose rather than natural causes," Detective Walsh explained. If your family was systematically drugging her as alleged, there should be evidence in tissue samples that wasn't tested during the original autopsy. The thought of Eleanor's body being disturbed was painful, but I knew she would have wanted the complete truth to come out regardless of how difficult the process might be. If my family had murdered her, they needed to face consequences for that crime as well as their theft and fraud. "Do whatever you need to do," I told Detective Walsh. "Eleanor deserves justice for everything they did to her." As night fell, I sat in my living room processing the events of a day that had completely transformed my understanding of what was possible in terms of legal justice. Just 48 hours earlier, I'd been sitting in this same room, dreading a Thanksgiving dinner where I expected to face family tension and awkward conversations. Now every member of my immediate family was in federal custody, facing charges that could result in decades in prison. The local evening news led with the story describing it as one of the most extensive elder abuse cases in the state's history. The anchor mentioned that the investigation was ongoing and that additional charges might be filed as authorities continued processing evidence and interviewing suspects. But perhaps the most surprising development was a phone call I received from Eleanor's longtime neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who'd been following the news coverage. "I always knew something wasn't right," she told me with obvious satisfaction. "Your grandmother was sharp as a tack until those last few months when she suddenly seemed confused and tired all the time. I tried to check on her more often, but your parents told me she didn't want visitors anymore." Mrs. Patterson went on to describe suspicious activity she'd witnessed during Eleanor's final months, including family members removing furniture and boxes from the house, when Eleanor was supposed to be in the hospital for routine tests. She'd thought about reporting her concerns at the time, but had been assured by my parents that everything was normal and that Eleanor was just downsizing her possessions. "I should have trusted my instincts," Mrs. Patterson said with regret. "But they were so convincing about how concerned they were for her welfare. They made me feel like I was being nosy and intrusive for worrying about someone I'd known for 30 years. As I went to bed that night, I felt a strange sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in months. The terrible weight of secret knowledge was finally lifted, replaced by the satisfaction of knowing that Eleanor's abusers would face consequences for their crimes. Justice was being served, truth was coming to light, and the people who'd planned to destroy my life were now facing the destruction of their own. But perhaps most importantly, I felt Eleanor's presence more strongly than ever, as if she was finally at peace, knowing that her suffering hadn't been in vain, and that other potential victims would be protected from similar abuse. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the legal process continued, but tonight I could sleep peacefully, knowing that the right side had won, and that love and integrity had ultimately triumphed over greed and betrayal. The next morning brought revelations that would expand the investigation far beyond what any of us had initially imagined. Thomas called me early with news that Amanda's cooperation had uncovered a network of elder abuse cases spanning multiple states and involving relatives I hadn't even considered as potential suspects. "Your sister's confession is opening doors we didn't know existed," Thomas explained, his voice carrying a mixture of excitement and disgust. "She's provided names, dates, and specific details about at least 3 other elderly victims who suffered similar abuse from the same group of family members over the past 7 years. Amanda had revealed that the conspiracy included our cousins Derek and Patricia, both of whom lived in neighboring states and had been targeting elderly relatives in their own communities. Derek, Uncle Greg's son, had been running a similar operation against his wife's grandfather in Ohio, while Patricia had been systematically robbing her elderly stepfather in Pennsylvania. But perhaps more shocking was Amanda's revelation that Eleanor's former caregiver, Sharon Williams, had been a key facilitator in the abuse rather than an innocent employee. Sharon had been stealing Eleanor's prescription medications and selling them while also providing inside information about Eleanor's daily routines and vulnerabilities to the family members planning their thefts. According to your sister, Sharon was filming Eleanor during vulnerable moments and using the footage to blackmail family members into giving her larger cuts of the stolen money. Thomas continued. She had recordings of your mother and uncle discussing their crimes, which she used as leverage to demand more payment for her silence. The scope of Sharon's betrayal was particularly heartbreaking because Eleanor had trusted her completely. Sharon had been working as Eleanor's caregiver for over 2 years, helping with daily activities and providing companionship during some of the loneliest periods of Eleanor's life. To learn that this trusted employee had been exploiting and humiliating Eleanor for financial gain added another layer of cruelty to an already horrific situation. Thomas went on to explain that Amanda's confession had also revealed the existence of a detailed record-keeping system that tracked multiple victims across several states. Derek had maintained a notebook documenting the assets and vulnerabilities of various elderly relatives, along with strategies for isolating them from potential protectors and timelines for maximum theft. "It's essentially an instruction manual for elder abuse," Thomas said with obvious revulsion, complete with photographs of valuable items, copies of important documents, and psychological profiles of each victim. They treated these elderly people like business opportunities rather than human beings. But the most disturbing revelation was that this network of family abusers had been sharing information and techniques for over 5 years, essentially running a criminal enterprise that specialized in exploiting vulnerable elderly relatives. They developed sophisticated methods for forging documents, manipulating medications, and framing innocent family members for their crimes. Amanda had provided investigators with contact information for Derek and Patricia, along with details about their current criminal activities. Federal agents were already coordinating with law enforcement in Ohio and Pennsylvania to investigate these additional cases and potentially rescue elderly victims who were currently being abused. "We think Derek's victim might still be alive and suffering ongoing abuse," Thomas told me. "Your sister described recent conversations where Derek bragged about keeping his victim confused with medication while he slowly emptied the man's bank accounts. The possibility that we might be able to save someone who is currently enduring the same kind of abuse Eleanor had suffered gave me a sense of purpose that helped offset some of the pain of learning about my family's crimes. Eleanor's courage in documenting her own abuse was now helping to protect other victims and expose a much larger criminal conspiracy." Later that afternoon, I received a call from Agent Rodriguez, who was leading the investigation in Ohio. She explained that they'd located Derek and his wife, Patricia, in Columbus, where they'd been living under false names while systematically robbing Patricia's stepfather, an 86-year-old veteran named Frank Morrison. "Mr. Morrison is alive, but in serious condition," Agent Rodriguez explained. "He's been heavily medicated and appears malnourished, consistent with the abuse patterns your sister described. We've taken him into protective custody, and he's currently receiving medical care at a secure facility." The discovery of another living victim transformed my understanding of what we'd accomplished by exposing this conspiracy. It wasn't just about getting justice for Eleanor anymore. It was about saving other elderly people who were currently trapped in situations similar to what Eleanor had endured. Agent Rodriguez went on to describe the evidence they'd found at Derek and Patricia's residence, including forged documents, stolen property, and detailed plans for framing Frank Morrison's daughter for theft when the old man eventually died. The parallels to our own case were unmistakable, suggesting that the family had developed a standard operating procedure for elder abuse that they applied systematically to multiple victims. "The good news is that Mr. Morrison is coherent enough to provide testimony," Agent Rodriguez continued. "Despite months of forced medication, he's been aware of what was happening and has been hoping someone would eventually come to help him. Your case probably saved his life." That evening, Thomas arranged for me to speak with Frank Morrison by phone from his hospital room. Despite his weakened condition, his voice was strong and clear as he thanked me for exposing the conspiracy that had trapped him in a nightmare of abuse and theft. "I knew something like this was happening to other people. Frank told me his words carrying decades of military discipline and determination. These criminals are like cancer, spreading from one victim to another until someone has the courage to stop them. Your grandmother would be proud of what you've done. Frank went on to describe his own experience with Derek and Patricia, which followed the same pattern Eleanor had endured: gradual isolation from friends and family, systematic theft of valuables, forced medication to maintain confusion, and plans to frame an innocent relative for the crimes. But Frank had been fighting back in his own way, secretly documenting abuse and hiding evidence whenever possible. I spent 30 years in the military fighting enemies of our country, Frank said with obvious pride. I wasn't about to let some two-bit criminals destroy me without a fight. I've been gathering evidence just like your grandmother did, waiting for the right moment to strike back. Frank's resistance had included palming medications instead of swallowing them, hiding valuable items that Derek and Patricia thought they'd stolen, and maintaining secret contact with neighbors who could serve as witnesses if needed. His military training had served him well in recognizing the signs of a coordinated attack and developing strategies for survival and resistance. The conversation with Frank filled me with admiration for the courage and determination elderly victims could show even in the most desperate circumstances. Both he and Eleanor had refused to accept their roles as helpless victims, instead becoming active participants in gathering evidence and planning for justice. But perhaps more importantly, Frank's survival meant that we now had a living witness who could testify about the conspiracy's methods and provide crucial evidence for prosecuting the entire network of criminals. His testimony would help ensure that Derek and Patricia faced consequences not just for their own crimes, but for their participation in the larger conspiracy that had victimized multiple elderly people across several states. As I ended the call with Frank, I felt Eleanor's presence more strongly than ever. Her courage in documenting her own abuse had not only protected me from false accusations, but had also saved the life of a stranger hundreds of miles away who was suffering the same kind of betrayal and exploitation. The investigation was revealing that elder abuse by family members might be more common and more organized than anyone had previously realized. The network we'd uncovered was just one example of how criminals were targeting vulnerable elderly relatives, confident that their crimes would go undetected and unpunished. But thanks to Eleanor's foresight and Frank's determination, this particular network was about to be completely destroyed, and other potential victims would be protected from similar abuse. Justice was expanding beyond our individual case to encompass a much larger fight against the systematic exploitation of elderly Americans by the people they trusted most. Within 48 hours of the arrests, our case had exploded into national news, transforming from a local criminal investigation into a symbol of elder abuse across America. The story seemed to strike a nerve with audiences who recognized similar patterns of family betrayal and exploitation in their own experiences, leading to an overwhelming response that none of us had anticipated. The first national coverage appeared on CNN, where legal analyst Jennifer Walsh described our case as a shocking example of how family members can weaponize trust and love to systematically destroy elderly relatives. The segment included interviews with elder abuse experts who explained that financial exploitation by family members was one of the fastest-growing crimes in America, affecting millions of elderly victims every year. But it was a feature story in the Washington Post that really brought national attention to the case. Investigative journalist Michael Chen had somehow obtained detailed information about Eleanor's recordings and the evidence she'd gathered, presenting a compelling narrative about an elderly woman's brave fight against her own family's criminality. Eleanor Morrison's secret war against her abusive family reads like something from a thriller novel. Chen wrote, "But the reality is far more tragic than any fictional account. While pretending to be confused and helpless, this remarkable woman was actually conducting one of the most sophisticated undercover operations ever documented in an elder abuse case. The article went on to describe how Eleanor had essentially become a private investigator in her own home, gathering evidence that would eventually protect not only herself, but also other victims of similar crimes. The piece painted her as a hero rather than a victim, emphasizing her intelligence, courage, and determination to ensure that justice would eventually be served. Within hours of the Post article's publication, my phone began ringing with interview requests from television producers, documentary filmmakers, and journalists from around the country. Everyone wanted to hear my side of the story, to understand how it felt to discover that your entire family was planning to destroy you, and to learn how I'd found the courage to work with federal investigators against my own relatives. Thomas helped me navigate the media attention, advising me about which interviews might be helpful for raising awareness about elder abuse and which ones might interfere with ongoing legal proceedings. We decided that I would participate in a few carefully selected interviews that focused on the broader issue of family financial exploitation, rather than specific details that might compromise the prosecution. My first national television appearance was on NBC's Today Show, where I was interviewed by Savannah Guthrie about the experience of discovering my family's crimes and the decision to cooperate with federal investigators. Sitting in that studio facing cameras that would broadcast my story to millions of people felt surreal after months of keeping such devastating secrets. It's important for people to understand that this kind of abuse is probably much more common than we realize. I told Savannah during our interview, elderly people are often reluctant to report abuse by family members and criminals. Like my family, count on that silence to continue their exploitation. The interview generated an enormous response from viewers who shared similar experiences with family betrayal and elder abuse. NBC's producers told me they'd received over 3,000 emails within hours of the broadcast, with many viewers describing their own struggles with relatives who'd stolen from elderly family members or attempted to frame innocent people for crimes they didn't commit. But perhaps the most significant media development was when CBS's 60 Minutes reached out about producing a full segment on our case. Correspondent Leslie Stahl wanted to explore not just the specific crimes my family had committed, but the broader epidemic of elder abuse and the sophisticated methods criminals were using to exploit vulnerable elderly people. The 60 Minutes interview required multiple sessions over several weeks as Leslie and her team worked to understand every aspect of the case, from Eleanor's initial suspicions through the arrests and ongoing prosecution. They interviewed Thomas and other federal agents involved in the investigation, along with elder abuse experts who could provide context about the national scope of the problem. What makes Eleanor's story so remarkable, Leslie said during one of our filming sessions, is that she essentially solved her own case. While her family thought they were drugging her into compliance, she was actually gathering evidence that would eventually bring them to justice. It's an incredible example of an elderly person refusing to accept the role of helpless victim. The 60 Minutes segment also featured an interview with Frank Morrison, the Ohio victim we'd helped rescue from Derek and Patricia's abuse. Despite his ordeal, Frank was eloquent and determined as he described his experience and praised Eleanor's courage in gathering evidence that had ultimately saved his life. "Eleanor Morrison is a hero," Frank said directly to the camera. "She knew she was dying, but she spent her last months fighting to protect other people from suffering the same abuse she'd endured. Every elderly person in America owes her a debt of gratitude." The media coverage was generating positive outcomes beyond just public awareness. Elder abuse hotlines reported significant increases in calls from people seeking help or reporting suspected abuse. Law enforcement agencies across the country began reviewing cold cases involving suspicious deaths of elderly people who'd been isolated from family and friends. Legislative proposals for stronger elder abuse protections were being introduced in multiple state capitals. But the media attention also brought unexpected personal connections. I began receiving letters and emails from other people who'd faced similar family betrayals, sharing their stories and offering support. Many had been forced to choose between family loyalty and doing what was right, and they understood the emotional complexity of my situation in ways that casual observers couldn't. One letter that particularly moved me came from a woman in Oregon whose father had been systematically robbed by her own siblings. "Reading about your courage gave me the strength to finally report my brothers to the police," she wrote. "I'd been afraid to destroy our family, but your story helped me realize that they had already destroyed it themselves." Another message came from a nurse in Florida who worked with elderly patients. "I see cases like Eleanor's all the time, but family members usually get away with it because victims are too afraid or confused to report the abuse," she explained. "Your grandmother's evidence gathering is inspiring other elderly people to fight back instead of accepting their fate as victims." The media attention was also having an impact on the legal proceedings. Thomas told me that the national coverage was making it easier to locate additional witnesses and evidence as people came forward with information about Derek and Patricia's crimes in other states. The public awareness was essentially crowdsourcing the investigation, with ordinary citizens providing tips that helped law enforcement agencies across multiple jurisdictions. Perhaps most importantly, the media coverage was honoring Eleanor's memory in a way that I knew would have made her proud. Instead of being remembered as a confused elderly woman who died helplessly, she was being celebrated as a brave fighter who'd protected others at great personal cost. Her story was inspiring people across the country to take elder abuse more seriously and to recognize that elderly people could be powerful allies in fighting against their own exploitation. As I reflected on the media storm surrounding our case, I realized that Eleanor's final gift to the world wasn't just justice for herself, but a raised awareness that might protect countless other elderly people from similar abuse. Her courage in gathering evidence had created ripple effects that extended far beyond our individual families' crimes, potentially saving lives and preventing suffering on a national scale. The story was no longer just about one family's betrayal, but about a society's obligation to protect its most vulnerable members and to recognize that elderly people deserve dignity, respect, and justice, regardless of their physical limitations or family circumstances. 6 months after the arrests, the federal courthouse in downtown became the stage for what local media dubbed the trial of the century for our region. The prosecution had decided to try all 5 defendants together, creating a courtroom drama that would unfold over several weeks and expose the full scope of the conspiracy in public testimony. I sat in the front row of the gallery directly behind the prosecution table, watching as my former family members were led into the courtroom in orange jumpsuits and restraints. The contrast between their current appearance and the well-dressed, respectable people I'd known my entire life was jarring. Margaret's carefully maintained hair was now gray and unkempt. Robert's confident posture had been replaced by a defeated slouch, and Amanda looked years older than her actual age. Uncle Greg maintained his silence on advice of counsel, but his previous boasts recorded by Eleanor had already destroyed any credibility he might have claimed. The recordings played in court captured him laughing about Eleanor's confusion and bragging about how easy it was to steal from the old woman without consequences. His own words painted him as the callous criminal he'd chosen to become. Jessica's appearance was perhaps the most dramatic change of all. The confident, professionally dressed bank employee I'd trusted for 15 years had been replaced by a hollow-eyed stranger who couldn't meet my gaze across the courtroom. Her lawyer had advised her to maintain a facade of remorse and confusion, but the evidence against her was too overwhelming for any believable defense. The opening statements revealed the prosecution's strategy of presenting the case as a conspiracy that had victimized not just Eleanor, but multiple elderly people across several states. Federal prosecutor Maria Santos outlined how the defendants had developed systematic methods for isolating, drugging, and robbing elderly relatives, while framing innocent family members for their crimes. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Santos began her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd prosecuted hundreds of criminal cases. You're going to hear evidence of crimes so callous, so carefully planned, and so completely without regard for human dignity that they may challenge your faith in the bonds of family and friendship. She went on to describe how Eleanor had endured months of systematic abuse while secretly gathering evidence that would eventually expose the entire conspiracy. The prosecution's case would rely heavily on Eleanor's recordings, which captured the defendants discussing their crimes in their own voices with shocking casualness. But the defense attorneys had coordinated their strategies around a central theme of denying responsibility and blaming other defendants. Margaret's lawyer claimed she'd been coerced by Robert and Uncle Greg, portraying her as another victim who'd been manipulated into criminal activity against her better judgment. Mrs. Morrison was a loving mother and grandmother who became trapped in a conspiracy orchestrated by more sophisticated criminals. Defense attorney James Patterson argued, while her actions were wrong, she was essentially another victim of the same manipulation that targeted Eleanor Morrison. Robert's defense took a different approach, with attorney Susan Chang arguing that Uncle Greg had been the mastermind of the conspiracy, and that Robert had participated only reluctantly to protect his wife from Greg's threats. Mr. Morrison was caught between loyalty to his brother-in-law and concern for his wife's safety. Chang told the jury, Greg Morrison used intimidation and emotional manipulation to force Robert's participation in crimes he never would have committed independently. Amanda's lawyer, David Rodriguez, attempted to paint her as a young woman who'd been pressured by older, more experienced criminals into activities she didn't fully understand. Ms. Morrison was barely out of college when this conspiracy began, Rodriguez argued. She was manipulated by family members she trusted, who exploited her youth and inexperience for their own criminal purposes. But perhaps the most creative defense came from Jessica's attorney, who argued that her banking expertise had been exploited by criminals who'd threatened to destroy her career and personal relationships if she didn't cooperate. Ms. Williams was essentially blackmailed into participating in financial fraud by people who threatened to falsely accuse her of crimes she didn't commit, attorney Michelle Torres claimed. She was trapped between helping criminals and facing false accusations that would have destroyed her life and career. The coordinated nature of these defenses, with each defendant blaming the others while claiming to be victims themselves, struck me as a continuation of the same manipulative behavior they'd exhibited throughout the conspiracy. Even facing overwhelming evidence of their crimes, they were still trying to avoid responsibility through lies and emotional manipulation. The prosecution's first witness was Dr. Sarah Martinez, the forensic pathologist who'd conducted the exhumation and toxicology testing on Eleanor's remains. Her testimony confirmed what Amanda had revealed during her confession: Eleanor had died from medication overdose rather than natural causes. The tissue samples showed levels of benzodiazepines and sleep aids that were at least 3 times higher than any reasonable therapeutic dose, Dr. Martinez explained to the jury. These medication levels would have caused severe confusion, respiratory depression, and eventually death in a person of Mrs. Morrison's age and health status. The doctor went on to explain that the medication overdose had been gradual rather than acute, suggesting systematic poisoning over several months rather than a single lethal dose. This testimony supported Eleanor's own recordings, where she described family members regularly adding extra pills to her food and drinks. But the most damaging testimony came from Thomas Bergen, who walked the jury through the evidence Eleanor had gathered and the sophisticated nature of her covert investigation. Mrs. Morrison essentially conducted one of the most thorough undercover operations I've seen in 20 years of federal law enforcement, Thomas testified. While pretending to be confused and helpless, she was actually documenting criminal activity with the precision of a trained investigator. The jury listened in fascination as Thomas described Eleanor's hidden recording devices, her secret documentation of stolen items, and her careful preservation of evidence that the defendants thought they'd successfully destroyed. The recordings were played in court, allowing the jury to hear the defendants' own voices as they planned crimes and discussed framing innocent people. During cross-examination, defense attorneys attempted to challenge the admissibility of Eleanor's recordings, arguing that she hadn't obtained proper consent from the people she'd recorded. But Judge Williams ruled that the recordings were admissible under exceptions for gathering evidence of crimes and protecting potential victims from ongoing abuse. The second week of testimony focused on the banking fraud facilitated by Jessica, with expert witnesses explaining how she'd used her position to create false accounts and process fraudulent transactions. Bank security footage showed Jessica meeting with my parents and Uncle Greg after hours accessing systems she had no legitimate reason to use during those meetings. Perhaps the most compelling witness was Frank Morrison, the Ohio victim, who'd been rescued as a result of our investigation. Despite his age and the trauma he'd endured, Frank's military bearing and clear testimony made a powerful impression on the jury. These defendants treated elderly people like business opportunities rather than human beings. Frank testified, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of his words. They developed methods for systematically destroying the final years of people who'd lived long, productive lives and deserved dignity and respect. Frank went on to describe the psychological torture of knowing his own relatives were slowly killing him while making him doubt his own sanity. His testimony connected our case to the broader pattern of elder abuse that extended beyond my family's specific crimes. But the trial's most dramatic moment came during the third week when Amanda took the stand as part of her cooperation agreement with prosecutors. Her testimony revealed details about the conspiracy that even the federal investigators hadn't known, including the existence of other elderly victims in different states who died under suspicious circumstances. We started small, taking little things that we thought Eleanor wouldn't notice. Amanda testified, her voice barely audible, as she described the evolution of their crimes. But Greg kept pushing us to take more valuable items, and when Eleanor started asking questions, he suggested we needed to keep her more confused so she couldn't interfere. Amanda's testimony revealed that Uncle Greg had been the driving force behind the systematic drugging that eventually killed Eleanor, convincing other family members that it was necessary to protect their conspiracy from discovery. Greg said we were already committed to the theft, so we might as well go all the way, Amanda continued. He said Eleanor was going to die soon anyway, so we were just speeding up something that was inevitable. The callousness revealed in Amanda's testimony was shocking even to people who'd been following the case closely. The defendants hadn't just been stealing from Eleanor, they'd been actively hastening her death to prevent her from exposing their crimes. Cross-examination of Amanda focused on her cooperation agreement and the reduced sentence she'd received in exchange for her testimony. Defense attorneys suggested that she was lying about other defendants' roles to further minimize her own responsibility. But Amanda's testimony was corroborated by the recordings Eleanor had made, which captured conversations where family members discussed medication strategies and debated how much confusion was necessary to maintain their theft operation. As the trial progressed, it became clear that the evidence against all 5 defendants was overwhelming. The recording's financial documents, witness testimony, and Amanda's insider knowledge created a comprehensive picture of a criminal conspiracy that had victimized multiple elderly people across several states. The courtroom gallery was packed every day with elder abuse advocates, family members of other victims, and journalists covering what had become a landmark case for elder abuse prosecution. Many observers seem to see the trial as a broader examination of how society treats its elderly members and what happens when family bonds are corrupted by greed and selfishness. For me, sitting through weeks of testimony about my family's crimes was emotionally exhausting, but also validating. Every piece of evidence confirmed that I'd made the right choice in cooperating with federal investigators, regardless of the personal cost. Eleanor's voice seemed to whisper encouragement from the recordings, reminding me that truth and justice were worth any amount of temporary pain. As the prosecution prepared to rest its case, I felt confident that Eleanor would finally receive the justice she'd died fighting for, and that other elderly people would be protected from similar abuse by the precedent this trial would establish. The fourth week of the trial brought a development that transformed our case from a family criminal matter into a national movement for elder abuse reform. Investigative journalist Michael Chen published a follow-up article in the Washington Post revealing that his investigation had uncovered 6 additional elderly victims across 3 states, all following the same pattern of family-orchestrated abuse and theft that had characterized Eleanor's case. The Morrison family conspiracy appears to be just the tip of the iceberg. Chen wrote, representing a systematic approach to elder abuse that may be far more widespread than law enforcement agencies have previously recognized. The article included interviews with family members of elderly victims who died under suspicious circumstances in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia over the past decade. Each case involved similar patterns: gradual isolation from friends and protective family members, systematic theft of valuables and financial assets, forced medication to maintain confusion, and suspicious deaths that had been attributed to natural causes without proper investigation. Chen's investigation had been triggered by tips from readers of his original article about our case, with people across the country reaching out to share stories of elderly relatives who'd suffered similar abuse. The volume of responses had convinced him that organized elder abuse by family members might represent a hidden epidemic affecting thousands of elderly Americans. What's most disturbing, Chen continued in his article, is how these cases follow such similar patterns that they suggest the existence of shared knowledge or even coordination among different groups of family abusers. The article prompted immediate action from the Department of Justice, which announced the formation of a multi-state task force to investigate suspected elder abuse cases and develop better methods for detecting and prosecuting family financial exploitation. Our case was being used as a model for training federal agents to recognize the warning signs of systematic elder abuse. But perhaps more significantly, Chen's investigation brought forward a living witness whose testimony would revolutionize our understanding of how these criminal networks operated. 82-year-old Henry Patterson had been presumed dead by his family for over 2 years, but had actually escaped their abuse and had been living under an assumed name in North Carolina while gathering evidence against his own relatives. Henry contacted Chen after reading about our case, explaining that he'd recognized the same patterns he'd experienced with his own adult children and grandchildren. His story was so similar to Eleanor's that it seemed like the same criminal organization had targeted both families despite the victims living in different states with no apparent connection. I'd been documenting my family's crimes for 3 years before I finally had to flee, Henry told Chen during their interview. They were slowly poisoning me with medication, stealing my belongings, and planning to claim I died naturally so they could inherit my property without any investigation. Henry had escaped his abusive family by faking his own death during a planned hospital stay, then assuming a new identity with help from a veterans organization that specialized in protecting elderly people from family abuse. He'd spent the past 2 years gathering evidence not just about his own case, but about a network of family abusers who shared techniques and strategies across state lines. These criminals communicate with each other, Henry explained to prosecutors when he agreed to testify in our trial. They share methods for isolating elderly victims, forging documents, and avoiding detection by authorities. It's essentially an organized crime network that specializes in exploiting vulnerable elderly people. Henry's testimony began during the trial's 5th week, and his military bearing and detailed knowledge made an immediate impact on the jury. Despite his age, he presented evidence with the precision of a trained investigator, including photographs, documents, and recordings he'd gathered during his 3 years of undercover work within his own abusive family. The defendants in this case used exactly the same techniques my children used against me. Henry testified, pointing to similarities in medication strategies, document forgery, and psychological manipulation. The methods are too sophisticated and too similar to be coincidental. Henry went on to describe how his own family had been coached by outside consultants who specialized in elder abuse, including a lawyer who helped forge wills and a nurse who provided advice about medication dosages that would cause confusion without obvious signs of poisoning. They treated elder abuse like a business. Henry continued, with professional services and standardized methods for maximum profit with minimum risk of detection. His testimony revealed that organized elder abuse was far more sophisticated than anyone had previously realized, involving professional criminal networks that provided services to families willing to pay for help exploiting their elderly relatives. But perhaps Henry's most important contribution was his detailed knowledge of other victims who were currently suffering abuse from family members connected to the same criminal network. His information led to immediate rescue operations in 4 different states, saving elderly people who were in immediate danger of death from forced medication overdoses. Mr. Patterson's courage in coming forward has probably saved dozens of lives, Prosecutor Maria Santos told the court. His evidence demonstrates that elder abuse by family members isn't just a series of isolated crimes, but a systematic problem that requires coordinated law enforcement response. The revelation that organized criminal networks were facilitating family elder abuse transformed public understanding of the problem and generated immediate legislative response. Congressional hearings were scheduled to examine federal elder abuse prevention programs, and multiple states began drafting legislation to strengthen penalties for family financial exploitation. Henry's testimony also provided crucial corroboration for Amanda's earlier statements about other victims in different states. His independent knowledge of cases that Amanda had described convinced the jury that the conspiracy extended far beyond my immediate family's crimes. These defendants didn't invent elder abuse, Henry testified during his final day on the stand, but they perfected methods for getting away with it by making victims appear mentally incompetent and framing innocent family members for crimes they didn't commit. The elder abuse advocacy community rallied around Henry's courage in speaking out with the National Center on Elder Abuse, naming him their Hero of the Year for risking his safety to expose criminal networks that were victimizing elderly Americans across the country. But for me, Henry's testimony provided something even more valuable than legal evidence. It proved that Eleanor hadn't been alone in her fight against family abuse. There were other elderly people who'd shown similar courage in gathering evidence and planning for justice, even when they knew they might not live to see their abusers punished. Your grandmother was part of a quiet revolution, Henry told me during a break in his testimony. Elderly people across this country are refusing to accept the role of helpless victims. We're fighting back, documenting crimes, and ensuring that justice will eventually be served. Henry's words reminded me that Eleanor's legacy extended beyond our individual case, to encompass a broader movement of elderly people who were taking active roles in protecting themselves and others from family abuse. Her courage had inspired others to speak out, creating a ripple effect that was exposing criminal networks and saving lives across multiple states. As Henry concluded his testimony, I felt Eleanor's presence more strongly than ever, as if she was standing with all the other elderly victims who'd refused to surrender to their abusers' plans. Their collective courage was transforming elder abuse from a hidden crime into a public priority that would receive the attention and resources necessary to protect vulnerable elderly people from family exploitation. The trial was no longer just about punishing my family's specific crimes, but about establishing precedents that would make elder abuse by family members much more difficult to commit and much easier to prosecute in the future. As the prosecution rested its case and the defense prepared their arguments, it became clear that the evidence against all 5 defendants was so overwhelming that continuing to trial would likely result in maximum sentences for everyone involved. Behind the scenes, defense attorneys began approaching prosecutors about possible plea agreements that might spare their clients from the harshest penalties federal law allowed. The first defendant to break ranks was Jessica, whose attorney had apparently concluded that her banking expertise made her particularly vulnerable to additional federal charges related to money laundering and financial institution fraud. Her cooperation could provide investigators with detailed information about how the conspiracy had used the banking system to facilitate their crimes across multiple states. Ms. Williams is prepared to provide comprehensive testimony about the financial aspects of this conspiracy in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her attorney, Michelle Torres, announced during a closed hearing with Judge Williams. She has detailed knowledge of banking procedures that were exploited to facilitate elder abuse, and her cooperation could help law enforcement prevent similar crimes in the future. Jessica's plea agreement required her to serve 5 years in federal prison and pay full restitution to all victims identified through the investigation. More importantly, she would be required to cooperate with ongoing investigations into elder abuse cases across multiple states using her banking expertise to help law enforcement understand how financial institutions could be exploited by family abusers. Thomas told me later that Jessica's cooperation had already proved valuable as she'd identified specific banking procedures that made it easy for family members to forge documents and access elderly relatives' accounts without proper oversight. She's provided us with a roadmap for closing loopholes that criminals have been exploiting for years, Thomas explained. Her information is helping us work with financial institutions to develop better protections for elderly customers who might be vulnerable to family exploitation. Uncle Greg's plea negotiations were more complex as prosecutors considered him the primary architect of the conspiracy and wanted to ensure that his sentence reflected his leadership role in multiple elder abuse cases. His attorney eventually agreed to a 12-year sentence in exchange for cooperation in investigating other elderly victims who'd suffered similar abuse. Gregory Morrison was the driving force behind a criminal enterprise that victimized elderly people across multiple states. Prosecutor Santos announced when the plea agreement was finalized. His sentence reflects both the severity of his crimes and the cooperation he's providing to help identify other victims and prevent future abuse. Uncle Greg's cooperation included detailed information about the professional criminal network that had provided services to family abusers, including the identities of lawyers, healthcare workers, and financial advisors who'd helped facilitate elder abuse in exchange for payment. My parents' plea negotiations took longer as their attorneys struggled to find cooperation value that would justify reduced sentences given their central role in Eleanor's abuse and death. Eventually, they agreed to 15-year sentences, each in exchange for testimony against the professional criminal network and assistance in locating assets that had been stolen from multiple elderly victims. Robert and Margaret Morrison's cooperation is helping us understand how criminal networks recruit and train family members to abuse elderly relatives, Santos explained when their plea agreements were announced. Their information is contributing to ongoing investigations that may result in dozens of additional prosecutions. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of the plea negotiations was the requirement that all defendants provide victim impact statements acknowledging the harm they'd caused to Eleanor and other elderly victims. These statements would become part of the permanent court record and would be required reading for anyone seeking early release or sentence reduction. Amanda's plea agreement was the most controversial as elder abuse advocates argued that her 8-year sentence was too lenient given her role in Eleanor's death and her participation in abusing other elderly victims. However, her cooperation had been crucial in exposing the broader criminal network and identifying victims who were still suffering ongoing abuse. Ms. Morrison's sentence reflects a careful balance between punishment for serious crimes and recognition of her substantial cooperation in exposing a criminal enterprise that was victimizing elderly people across multiple states, Judge Williams explained when approving her plea agreement. Amanda's cooperation requirements were extensive, including ongoing testimony in related cases, assistance in victim identification, and participation in educational programs designed to help law enforcement recognize signs of family elder abuse. The plea agreements meant that the trial would conclude without the defendants testifying in their own defense, sparing me the additional trauma of listening to them attempt to justify or minimize their crimes. Instead, the focus shifted to victim impact statements and the broader implications of the case for elder abuse prevention and prosecution. Henry Patterson provided a powerful victim impact statement on behalf of all elderly victims of family abuse, describing the psychological trauma of being betrayed by people who were supposed to provide love and protection. The defendants didn't just steal money and possessions, Henry told the court during his statement. They stole dignity, trust, and peace of mind from people who'd spent decades building loving relationships with family members. The emotional damage they caused will last far longer than any financial losses. I provided my own victim impact statement focusing on Eleanor's courage and the importance of ensuring that other elderly people would be protected from similar abuse. My grandmother Eleanor died fighting to protect other elderly people from the kind of abuse she'd endured, I told the court. The best way to honor her memory is to ensure that her evidence and sacrifice lead to systemic changes that will prevent other families from suffering the same kind of betrayal and exploitation. The victim impact portion of the proceedings also included statements from family members of other elderly victims who'd been identified through the investigation, creating a powerful record of the human cost of family elder abuse that would be preserved for future legal proceedings and educational purposes. Detective Susan Walsh from the coroner's office provided a statement about the reopened investigation into Eleanor's death, confirming that the toxicology evidence supported charges of negligent homicide against all defendants who'd participated in the systematic drugging that had hastened Eleanor's death. Mrs. Morrison's death was not natural, Detective Walsh told the court. She was slowly murdered by people she trusted, and the evidence clearly shows that her death was the foreseeable result of systematic poisoning designed to facilitate theft and prevent her from seeking help. As the plea agreements were finalized, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice was being served, and the defendants would face significant consequences for their crimes. But no amount of punishment could restore Eleanor's final years or undo the trauma she'd endured at the hands of people who'd claimed to love her. However, the cooperation agreements meant that the investigation would continue expanding, potentially identifying and rescuing other elderly victims while dismantling the criminal networks that facilitated family elder abuse. Eleanor's courage in gathering evidence was continuing to protect vulnerable elderly people months after her death. The plea agreements also established legal precedents that would make it easier to prosecute similar cases in the future, while the publicity surrounding our case was raising public awareness about the signs of family elder abuse and encouraging other victims to seek help. As Judge Williams prepared to announce the final sentences, I knew that Eleanor would have been proud of what her evidence had accomplished. Her suffering hadn't been in vain, and her legacy would continue protecting elderly people for years to come. 3 weeks after the sentencing, Eleanor's attorney, David Walsh, called me with news that would provide the final chapter in my grandmother's remarkable story of fighting back against her abusers. The completion of the criminal proceedings had cleared the way for executing Eleanor's true will, the one she'd hidden from her family while they'd been planning to steal her estate and frame me for their crimes. There are some surprises in Eleanor's final wishes that I think you're going to find remarkable, David told me over the phone. She was far more prepared for this situation than any of us realized, and her planning extends well beyond just protecting you from false accusations. I met David at his law office downtown, the same building where Eleanor had secretly been working to ensure that justice would eventually be served. The conference room was lined with boxes of documents and financial records that represented Eleanor's true legacy, carefully preserved, despite her family's attempts to steal and destroy evidence of her actual wishes. "Your grandmother was one of the most forward-thinking clients I've ever worked with." David began opening a folder thick with legal documents. She understood that her family was planning to steal from her estate, so she took steps to protect not just her assets but also her values and her commitment to helping other elderly people who might face similar abuse. Eleanor's true will revealed that her estate was worth far more than any of us had realized. Beyond the house car and known financial accounts, she'd been quietly accumulating wealth through careful investments and had hidden various valuable assets in locations her family had never discovered. "The total value of Eleanor's estate is just over $800,000, David announced, and I nearly fell out of my chair with surprise. She'd been moving assets into hidden accounts and investments for over 2 years, anticipating that her family would eventually try to steal everything she owned. But Eleanor's financial planning was even more sophisticated than simple asset protection. She'd established a series of charitable trusts designed to fund elder abuse prevention programs, while ensuring that people who genuinely loved her would receive meaningful inheritances. Eleanor left specific bequests to several organizations working to combat elder abuse and protect vulnerable elderly people." David continued. "She wanted her money to continue fighting the kind of criminals who'd targeted her, ensuring that other elderly people would have better protection and support. The largest charitable bequest was $200,000 to the National Center on Elder Abuse, designated specifically for developing training programs to help law enforcement recognize and investigate family financial exploitation. Eleanor had also left $50,000 each to 3 local organizations that provided support services for elderly abuse victims. But perhaps the most touching bequest was $100,000 to fund a scholarship program for young people studying law enforcement social work or geriatrics, with preference given to applicants who'd experienced family betrayal or financial exploitation. Eleanor wanted to ensure that future professionals would understand the devastating impact of family abuse on elderly victims. She specifically requested that the scholarship be named after Frank Morrison. David explained, "The veteran who'd been rescued because of the investigation your case prompted. She'd never met him, but she'd learned about his courage through media coverage and wanted to honor his determination to fight back against family abuse." Eleanor's personal bequests reflected her understanding of who'd genuinely loved her versus who'd been motivated by greed and inheritance expectations. Henry Patterson, who'd become a symbol of elderly resistance to family abuse, received her antique military medal collection along with a letter thanking him for inspiring other elderly victims to fight back against their abusers. The bulk of Eleanor's personal estate came to me, including the house where I'd grown up visiting her, her car, $50,000 in cash, and all her personal photographs and family heirlooms. But more importantly, she'd left me with detailed instructions for continuing her work to protect elderly people from family exploitation. "Eleanor wanted you to understand that this inheritance comes with responsibility," David said, handing me a sealed letter addressed to me personally. "She saw you as the keeper of her values and her commitment to justice for elderly abuse victims." Eleanor's final letter to me was longer than the one she'd hidden for the federal investigation, filled with personal memories and expressions of love that brought tears to my eyes. But it also contained specific instructions for using her inheritance to continue fighting elder abuse and supporting other people who'd faced similar family betrayals. "My dear Helene," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then justice has been served and my abusers have faced consequences for their crimes. But more importantly, you've proven that love and integrity are stronger than greed and selfishness. Eleanor went on to describe her hope that I would use her house as a center for supporting elderly abuse victims and their families, providing a safe space where people could share their experiences and find the strength to seek justice against abusive family members. I know this inheritance will feel overwhelming, Eleanor continued, but remember that you're not carrying this burden alone. There are many people like Frank Morrison and Henry Patterson who understand the importance of protecting vulnerable elderly people from family exploitation. The letter concluded with Eleanor's vision for transforming her suffering into a legacy of protection and support for other elderly victims. I endured months of abuse and betrayal so that you would have the evidence needed to stop these criminals and protect other potential victims, she wrote. Now I'm trusting you to ensure that my suffering continues to serve a purpose by helping other elderly people find the courage to fight back against family members who would exploit their trust and vulnerability. As I finished reading Eleanor's letter, David presented me with the keys to her house and the title to her car, along with account information for the financial assets she'd left me. But more significantly, he handed me a detailed business plan Eleanor had developed for establishing a nonprofit organization dedicated to elder abuse prevention and victim support. She spent months researching this, David explained. Eleanor wanted to create a model program that could be replicated in communities across the country, providing elderly people with resources and support for protecting themselves from family exploitation. Eleanor's business plan included partnerships with law enforcement agencies, healthcare providers, and social service organizations to create comprehensive protection networks for vulnerable elderly people. She'd identified funding sources, potential staff members, and specific services that would address the gaps in current elder abuse prevention programs. But perhaps most remarkably, Eleanor had anticipated that her case would generate media attention and had prepared materials for using that publicity to raise awareness about elder abuse and encourage policy changes to better protect elderly victims. Your grandmother essentially created a roadmap for turning her personal tragedy into a national movement for elder abuse reform, David concluded. She understood that her suffering would only have meaning if it led to systematic changes that protected other elderly people from similar abuse. As I left David's office with Eleanor's true inheritance, I felt the weight of responsibility she'd placed on my shoulders. The money and property were significant, but her real legacy was the expectation that I would continue her fight for justice and protection for elderly Americans who were vulnerable to family exploitation. Eleanor had transformed her final months of abuse into a comprehensive plan for elder abuse prevention, ensuring that her suffering would continue to serve a purpose long after her death. Her inheritance wasn't just about providing for my future. It was about creating a better future for all elderly people who might face the kind of betrayal and exploitation she'd endured. That evening, I sat in Eleanor's kitchen, now my kitchen, reading through her detailed plans for fighting elder abuse and protecting vulnerable elderly people. Her presence filled the house not as a ghost haunted by past trauma, but as a continued source of inspiration and guidance for the important work that lay ahead. Eleanor's final gift wasn't just financial security. It was a mission that would give meaning to both her suffering and my future, ensuring that her courage and determination would continue protecting elderly people for generations to come. 6 months after receiving Eleanor's inheritance, I found myself standing in what had once been her living room, now transformed into a welcoming meeting space for the Eleanor Morrison Center for Elder Abuse Prevention. The walls that had once hidden recording devices now displayed inspiring messages and photographs of elderly abuse survivors who'd found the courage to seek justice and rebuild their lives. The center had grown organically from Eleanor's business plan, but the reality exceeded anything she could have imagined. What started as a local support group had evolved into a comprehensive resource center that was already being replicated in 6 other states, Word had spread through elder abuse advocacy networks that we'd created something special, a place where victims and their families could find both practical help and emotional healing. Our weekly support group meetings drew people from across the region, creating a community of survivors who understood each other's experiences in ways that outside observers never could. Frank Morrison had become our most inspiring regular speaker, sharing his story of survival and resistance while encouraging newer members to find their own strength and voice. What Eleanor did for all of us. Frank told our group during one particularly moving meeting was proof that elderly people don't have to accept the role of helpless victims. We can fight back, we can gather evidence, and we can ensure that justice is served even when our own families turn against us. Frank's military bearing and clear-eyed determination had a profound impact on people who were just beginning to recognize signs of abuse in their own families. His presence reminded everyone that courage and dignity weren't diminished by age, and that elderly people could be powerful allies in fighting against exploitation and betrayal. The center had also attracted professional volunteers who shared Eleanor's commitment to protecting vulnerable elderly people. Dr. Sarah Chen, a geriatric psychiatrist, provided counseling services for abuse survivors dealing with trauma and family betrayal. Attorney Michael Rodriguez offered legal advice for people navigating complex family situations or considering reporting abuse to authorities. But perhaps our most valuable volunteer was Detective Lisa Washington from the County Elder Abuse Unit, who'd been inspired by Eleanor's case to specialize in family financial exploitation. Lisa provided training sessions for center members on recognizing signs of abuse and documenting evidence, essentially teaching Eleanor's techniques to other potential victims. Mrs. Morrison showed us what's possible when elderly people refuse to accept abuse silently. Lisa told our group during one of her training sessions. She developed investigation techniques that professional law enforcement officers now study and apply in their own cases. The training sessions were particularly popular with elderly people who'd noticed suspicious behavior from family members but weren't sure whether their concerns were justified. Lisa's practical advice on recognizing manipulation tactics and documenting suspicious activities had already helped 3 center members gather evidence that led to successful prosecutions of abusive relatives. The center had also become a resource for family members who suspected that elderly relatives were being abused but didn't know how to help or where to seek support. We developed educational materials explaining warning signs of family financial exploitation and providing guidance for people who wanted to protect elderly loved ones without causing family conflicts. One of our most successful programs was a monthly workshop for adult children and grandchildren who wanted to learn how to have difficult conversations with elderly relatives about protecting themselves from potential abuse. These workshops address the delicate balance between offering help and respecting elderly people's autonomy and independence. Eleanor's story teaches us that elderly people are often more aware of abuse than their families realize. I explained during one of these workshops. Our role isn't to rescue helpless victims, but to support strong, capable people who need allies and resources to fight back against exploitation. The center had also attracted national attention from researchers studying elder abuse prevention and policy advocates working to strengthen legal protections for elderly Americans. Dr. Jennifer Walsh from the National Institute on Aging had visited to study our model and was working to incorporate our approaches into federal elder abuse prevention programs. The Eleanor Morrison Center represents a new paradigm for elder abuse prevention. Dr. Walsh told a conference of researchers and policymakers, instead of treating elderly people as passive victims who need protection, this model recognizes them as active participants in their own safety and powerful advocates for systemic change. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from Henry Patterson, who'd traveled from North Carolina to attend our first anniversary celebration. His presence reminded everyone that the center's work extended far beyond our local community to encompass a national movement of elderly people refusing to accept abuse silently. Eleanor Morrison saved my life by inspiring me to come forward with evidence about criminal networks targeting elderly people, Henry told the anniversary gathering. Now this center is saving other lives by giving people the support and resources they need to fight back against family exploitation. The anniversary celebration also featured a video message from Thomas Bergen, who'd been promoted within the FBI partly based on his success in investigating our case and developing new approaches to family financial exploitation cases. The Eleanor Morrison Center represents the best possible outcome from a terrible situation, Thomas said in his recorded message. Eleanor's suffering has been transformed into a resource that's protecting countless elderly people from similar abuse, while the investigative techniques she developed are helping law enforcement agencies across the country prosecute family exploitation cases. The center's success had also generated unexpected personal healing for me, providing a sense of purpose that helped offset the pain of losing my biological family to their own criminal choices. Working with abuse survivors and their families reminded me daily that family isn't defined by blood relationships, but by people who support each other during difficult times and share common values about treating others with dignity and respect. My new family included people like Frank Morrison and Henry Patterson, whose courage and determination inspired me to continue Eleanor's work. It included Dr. Chen and Detective Washington, whose professional expertise enhanced our ability to help people in crisis. It included dozens of abuse survivors who'd found their voices and their strength through our support programs. But perhaps most importantly, it included the memory of Eleanor herself, whose presence filled every corner of the center and guided every decision we made about how to serve people facing family betrayal and exploitation. Her courage in fighting back against her abusers had created a legacy that extended far beyond her individual case to encompass a movement that was changing how society understood and responded to elder abuse. As I looked around the anniversary celebration, seeing elderly abuse survivors sharing stories and supporting each other, seeing family members learning how to protect elderly loved ones, seeing professionals collaborating to improve elder abuse prevention, I knew that Eleanor's sacrifice had created something beautiful and lasting from the ugliness of family betrayal. The center had become more than just a support group or resource facility. It had become a symbol of hope for elderly people facing abuse and a model for communities seeking to protect their most vulnerable members. Eleanor's courage in documenting her own abuse had rippled outward to create waves of positive change that were protecting elderly people across the country. Most importantly, the center ensured that Eleanor's story would continue inspiring other elderly people to fight back against abuse, proving that age and vulnerability didn't have to mean helplessness, and that justice was possible even in the most difficult family situations. 2 years after that devastating Thanksgiving, when my parents turned me away from their door, I stood in Eleanor's kitchen. Now my kitchen, preparing a feast that would honor everything my grandmother had taught me about the true meaning of family and gratitude. The house she'd left me had been transformed into both a home and a symbol of hope for elderly abuse survivors, and this Thanksgiving dinner would celebrate all the ways her courage had continued to protect and inspire people long after her death. The dining room table was set with Eleanor's finest china and silver pieces that had been recovered from my family's theft and now served their intended purpose of bringing people together in genuine love rather than greed. The centerpiece featured photographs of Eleanor and other elderly abuse survivors who'd found the courage to fight back against family exploitation, reminding everyone that we were celebrating not just our current blessings, but also the courage of people who'd suffered to make our gathering possible. My guests represented the true family Eleanor had envisioned, bound together not by blood, but by shared values of integrity, compassion, and justice. Frank Morrison sat at the head of the table, his military bearing softened by the warmth of genuine friendship and mutual respect. At 84, he'd become not just a fellow survivor, but a beloved grandfather figure who taught me that age could bring wisdom and strength rather than vulnerability and helplessness. Henry Patterson had driven down from North Carolina for the occasion, bringing with him stories of other elderly people who'd been inspired by Eleanor's courage to document abuse and seek justice against exploitative family members. His presence reminded everyone that our individual healing was connected to a larger movement of elderly Americans refusing to accept the role of silent victims. Thomas Bergen and his wife Maria had become close friends over the 2 years since the investigation concluded, their support and understanding helping me navigate the complex emotions of rebuilding my life after family betrayal. Thomas had been promoted to head the FBI's new Elder Abuse Task Force, a position created partly in response to the national attention our case had generated. Dr. Sarah Chen and Detective Lisa Washington represented the professional allies who joined Eleanor's mission to protect vulnerable elderly people from family exploitation. Their presence at our table symbolized the collaboration between survivors, advocates, and professionals that was transforming how society understood and responded to elder abuse. But perhaps the most meaningful presence was that of Margaret Foster, an 87-year-old woman who'd been rescued from family abuse 6 months earlier using techniques Eleanor had developed and our center had refined. Margaret's daughter and son-in-law had been systematically stealing from her while planning to have her declared incompetent, but Margaret had remembered Eleanor's story from news coverage and had begun secretly documenting their crimes. Eleanor Morrison gave me permission to trust my own instincts. Margaret had told me when she first came to the center for help. When my family told me I was getting confused and paranoid, I remembered how your grandmother's family had told her the same things while they were robbing her. That's when I knew I needed to start gathering evidence. Margaret's successful prosecution of her abusive family members had generated additional media coverage that continued to raise awareness about elder abuse and inspire other victims to seek help. Her presence at our Thanksgiving table represented the ongoing impact of Eleanor's courage, demonstrating how one person's refusal to accept abuse could create ripple effects that protected countless others. As we gathered around the table, I felt Eleanor's presence more strongly than ever, not as a ghost haunted by past trauma, but as a continuing source of inspiration and guidance for the work we were all doing to protect elderly people from exploitation and betrayal. Frank Morrison offered the blessing, his voice strong and clear, as he thanked God for bringing together people who understood the importance of protecting vulnerable members of society. "We're grateful not just for this meal and this company," he said, "but for the courage of Eleanor Morrison, whose refusal to accept abuse silently has protected countless elderly people from similar suffering." As we shared the feast I'd prepared using many of Eleanor's recipes, conversation flowed naturally from personal updates to discussions about ongoing cases and advocacy efforts. Thomas described new federal legislation that would strengthen penalties for family financial exploitation, while Detective Washington talked about training programs that were teaching law enforcement agencies to recognize signs of elder abuse that might previously have been overlooked. Dr. Chen shared research showing that elder abuse survivors who received appropriate support services were remarkably resilient, often emerging from their experiences with renewed strength and commitment to helping other victims. Her work with center members had contributed to academic understanding of how elderly people could recover from family betrayal and rebuild their lives around healthier relationships. Henry Patterson provided updates on the national network of elder abuse survivors that had emerged partly in response to media coverage of our case. Support groups similar to our center were operating in over 20 states, creating communities where elderly people could find understanding and encouragement from others who'd faced similar challenges. Eleanor's story proved that elderly people could fight back against abuse, Henry reflected as we shared dessert made from Eleanor's apple pie recipe. But more than that, it showed us that fighting back could create something beautiful and lasting from terrible experiences. As the evening wound down, I found myself standing at Eleanor's kitchen window, looking out at the garden she'd tended with such care during her final years. The flower beds that had once provided cover for her secret evidence gathering now bloomed with varieties chosen to attract butterflies and hummingbirds, creating beauty that would continue growing and spreading long after the pain of her abuse had faded into memory. Margaret Foster joined me at the window, her weathered hands steady as she helped me package leftover food for our guests to take home. "You know," she said quietly, "Eleanor would be so proud of what you've built from her suffering. This house has become a place of healing and hope instead of just a crime scene." Margaret's words captured something essential about the transformation that had occurred over the past 2 years. Eleanor's house was no longer defined by the abuse she'd endured within its walls, but by the love and support that now filled its rooms. The dining room where my family had planned my destruction was now a place where abuse survivors shared stories of courage and recovery. The living room where Eleanor had hidden recording devices was now a meeting space where elderly people learned to recognize manipulation and protect themselves from exploitation. As our guests prepared to leave, each carrying containers of food and expressions of gratitude for a meaningful Thanksgiving celebration, I realized that Eleanor's final gift to me hadn't been financial security or even protection from false accusations. Her greatest gift had been the example of how to transform suffering into service, how to find purpose in pain, and how to build authentic family relationships with people who shared your values and supported your highest aspirations. Before Frank Morrison left, he pressed a small wrapped package into my hands. "This belonged to Eleanor," he explained with a gentle smile. "Thomas recovered it from evidence and thought you should have it back." Inside the package was Eleanor's favorite brooch, the one that had concealed a recording device during her final months. But now, instead of hiding surveillance equipment, it held a small note in Eleanor's handwriting. "For Helene, with love and confidence that you'll use your gifts to protect others who need protection." As I pinned the brooch to my dress, I felt the weight of Eleanor's trust and the lightness of her love surrounding me like a warm embrace. The woman who'd endured months of abuse while secretly fighting for justice had somehow known that her courage would inspire others to continue her work long after her death. Standing in the doorway of what had become both my home and Eleanor's legacy, I watched my chosen family drive away into the November night, each carrying pieces of the love and hope that had grown from Eleanor's refusal to accept abuse silently. The house that had once hidden terrible secrets was now filled with the warmth of genuine relationships and shared purpose. As I cleaned up the remnants of our feast using Eleanor's dishes and following routines she'd established decades earlier, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from devastating family betrayal to this moment of profound gratitude and peace. The people who'd claimed to love me while planning my destruction were serving federal prison sentences, while the people who genuinely loved me had gathered around Eleanor's table to celebrate not just our current blessings, but also our commitment to protecting others who face similar challenges. Eleanor's courage in fighting back against her abusers had created a legacy that extended far beyond her individual case, to encompass a movement that was changing how society understood and responded to elder abuse. Her house had become a center for healing and advocacy. Her story had inspired legislation and policy changes, and her example had given countless elderly people the courage to fight back against family exploitation. But perhaps most importantly, Eleanor had taught me that family isn't defined by blood relationships or legal obligations, but by people who stand with you during your darkest moments and share your commitment to treating others with dignity and respect. The people who'd gathered around her table that Thanksgiving evening represented the family she'd envisioned, bound together by love, strengthened by shared values, and committed to protecting vulnerable members of our community. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs to the bedroom that had once been Eleanor's sanctuary, I carried with me the knowledge that her suffering had not been in vain. Every elderly person who'd found the courage to report abuse, every family member who'd learned to recognize signs of exploitation, every law enforcement officer who'd been trained to investigate elder abuse cases more effectively represented a continuation of Eleanor's fight for justice and dignity. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the center continued its work, and the movement for elder abuse reform expanded to protect more vulnerable elderly people. But tonight I could sleep peacefully, knowing that love and integrity had ultimately triumphed over greed and betrayal, and that Eleanor's legacy would continue protecting elderly people for generations to come. The house was quiet except for the familiar sounds of settling wood and November wind in the eaves, but it was filled with the presence of everyone who'd been gathered around Eleanor's table in genuine love and gratitude. Her courage in refusing to accept abuse silently had created this moment of peace and hope, proving that even the most devastating family betrayals could be transformed into something beautiful and lasting. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and doing what's right, even when it meant standing alone against people you'd trusted your entire life? Eleanor's story reminds us that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is refuse to enable harmful behavior, even when it comes from people we care about. If you've found strength in this story, or know someone who might need to hear Eleanor's message of courage and hope, please share it with others who could benefit from knowing that they're not alone in facing difficult family situations. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Eleanor's fight for justice and the healing that followed. I hope her example inspires you to stand up for what's right, protect vulnerable people in your own community, and remember that true family is defined by love and respect rather than blood relationships. May you find the courage to create the life and relationships you deserve, just as Eleanor taught me to do.